pen was already moving toward the paper when the voice came from the corner of the room. "Ms. Hartwell, those numbers on page 9 are wrong." Catherine Hartwell stopped, not because she believed him. She stopped because, in 22 years of boardrooms, no one had ever interrupted her at a moment like this. Not a partner, not a CFO, certainly not the man in the gray uniform who had been quietly restocking the supply cart by the door. She looked up. He was holding a ream of copy paper in one hand and staring at the projected financial summary on the wall behind her legal team. His face was calm, not nervous, not apologetic, just certain. "Excuse me," said Douglas Payne, her chief financial officer, turning in his chair. His voice had that particular edge that people like Douglas used when they wanted someone to disappear without having to say the word directly. The man didn't move. He set the paper down on the cart, carefully, and pointed at the screen. "The amortization schedule on page 9. The depreciation figure for the Pacific Northwest properties is being applied at a 12-year curve, but those assets were reclassified as mixed use in 2019. They should be running on a 15-year curve." He paused. "That gap accounts for roughly $31 million in artificial losses." The room went completely silent. Catherine didn't look at Douglas. She looked at the man in a gray uniform. He had a name badge clipped to his chest. It read, "Weston, Facilities." "Who let you in here?" Douglas said. "I work here," Weston said simply. "This is a closed session." "Douglas." Catherine's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a line through water. She set the pen down on the table, not to the side, flat down, parallel to the document, as if she were choosing to remember exactly where she had left it. She looked at the projected screen, page 9. She had read page 9 4 times in the past 48 hours. She had read it at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, with a glass of water gone warm beside her. She had read it in the car on the way here, her driver navigating the rain-slick streets while she sat in the back with the folder open in her lap and the familiar sick feeling spreading behind her sternum. The feeling she had learned to call acceptance because the alternative was falling apart in front of people who were watching her too closely already. She had read page 9 and she had believed it, because Douglas had built it, because 3 outside auditors had reviewed it, because Whitmore Capital had sent their own team in for 2 weeks and their team had come back and said the same thing. Hartwell Meridian is insolvent. The liabilities are real. The exit is the only rational path. $31 million. She pulled the folder toward her, found page 9, found the depreciation table. The numbers sat there in crisp 12-point font, unmoved, indifferent to the possibility that they were wrong. They had always looked that way to her, like settled facts rather than calculations, like gravity. "What's your full name?" she said. "Weston Carr." "How do you know about amortization schedules, Mr. Carr?" Something shifted in his expression. Not defensiveness, more like a door opening onto a room he didn't often let people see. "I used to teach it," he said. "Corporate accounting, City College, night program." Douglas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're a janitor who used to teach accounting." "Facilities technician," Weston said. "And yes." Catherine stood up. The lawyers shifted in their seats. The 2 men from Whitmore Capital exchanged a glance. Douglas said her name Catherine, in that particular tone that meant "you are embarrassing us," and she had heard that tone from men in suits her entire career, and she was very, very tired of the way it made her want to shrink herself to accommodate them. "Get me the original reclassification documents for the Pacific Northwest properties," she said. "The 2019 filing. I want it in this room in the next 20 minutes. "Catherine, we don't need to." "Douglas," she turned to look at him, "get me the documents." The first time Catherine Hartwell had sat in a boardroom, she was 26 years old and she was the only woman at the table and the only person in the room who had not come for money. She had come from Akron, Ohio, from a 2-bedroom house with a basement that flooded every spring, from a mother who worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria and a father who had left when Catherine was 9 and sent birthday cards that always arrived 3 weeks late, as if he were estimating the date from a considerable distance. She had gotten a scholarship to Ohio State, then another one to Wharton. She had worked harder than anyone around her for 2 decades, not because she was trying to prove something, but because she genuinely did not know another way to live. Hard work was the only currency she had ever had that no one could take from her. She had built Hartwell Meridian from a regional property management firm into one of the most respected commercial real estate development companies in the Pacific Northwest, 47 employees, 312 managed properties, a reputation that had taken her 18 years to assemble, carefully the way you assemble something fragile, knowing the whole time that it could shatter. And then 18 months ago, the market had shifted. Interest rates, supply chain delays on 2 major developments, a contractor bankruptcy that had left her holding 3 half-finished buildings and a mountain of breach claims. The losses had compounded faster than she could absorb them. She had called in Douglas Payne, who came highly recommended, who had a wall of credentials and a handshake so practiced it felt like a signature. And Douglas had looked at the books and said, "The numbers don't lie." She had believed him. She had believed the auditors. She had believed the men from Whitmore Capital who walked through her offices with their clipboards and their matching navy suits and their careful, sympathetic expressions that never quite reached their eyes. She had believed all of them. She had almost signed. The reclassification documents arrived in 19 minutes. Catherine spread them across the conference table herself, pushing the Whitmore Capital folders aside without ceremony. Weston Carr stood at the far end of the table. No one had invited him to sit, and he hadn't asked. And he walked her through it methodically, his finger tracing the lines of text with the quiet precision of someone who had explained this particular type of problem many times before. The 2019 filing was unambiguous. The Pacific Northwest properties had been formally reclassified. The applicable depreciation curve was 15 years. The error in the financial summary was not a rounding issue or a formatting mistake. It was systematic. It ran through 6 separate line items across 3 fiscal years. "What does this do to the aggregate loss figure?" Catherine asked. Weston did the math in his head. She watched him do it, not on a phone, not on a calculator. In his head, his eyes moving slightly the way her own eyes moved when she was working through something. Reduces it by somewhere between $80 and $94 million depending on how you handle the associated tax position. He looked at her. "Your company isn't insolvent, Ms. Hartwell. Not even close." The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system cycling on in the ceiling. Douglas said very carefully, "Those figures will need to be independently verified." "Yes," Catherine said. "They will." She did not look at him. "By someone other than you." Douglas opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I resent the implication." "I'm not implying anything, Douglas." She finally looked at him, and something in her face made him stop. "I'm telling you that I'm going to have every document your team produced reviewed by an independent forensic accounting firm, starting tonight." She paused. "If you'd like to get ahead of that process by telling me now whether there's anything else I should know, I'd encourage you to do that." Douglas Payne said nothing. Catherine nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she already suspected. She turned to the men from Whitmore Capital. "Gentlemen, I think we're going to need to reschedule." She found Weston in the hallway afterward, loading his cart. He was doing it the same way he'd done everything else, carefully, without hurry, as if the events of the past hour had cost him nothing. A folding table was stacked against the wall. He lifted it onto the cart and secured it with a strap that had been repaired at some point with a length of electrical tape. "Mr. Carr," she said. He looked up. "Why did you say something?" She genuinely wanted to know. Most people wouldn't have. He was quiet for a moment, not like he was deciding whether to answer, more like he was deciding how. "I've got a daughter," he said finally. "She's 7. Her name is Penny." He straightened up, his hands easy at his sides. "She asked me once why I work nights when all the other dads work days. I told her it was so I could take her to school in the morning. She thought about it for a second, and then she said, 'Okay, that makes sense.'" He almost smiled. "She's very practical." Catherine waited. "I used to run the accounting department at a firm downtown," he said. "Rowan and Associates. Maybe you've heard of it." She had. Rowan and Associates had collapsed 6 years ago in what the business press had described, with characteristic understatement, as a significant governance failure. Several people had gone to prison. Several more had simply gone away and reinvented themselves elsewhere. "I testified," Weston said. "I was the one who found the discrepancies. I brought them to the partners first, and when that didn't work, I went to the SEC. His voice was very even. After the trial, no one in the industry would hire me. Can't really blame them. Nobody wants the guy who blew up the firm at their table." He looked down at the cart. "I've been doing this for 4 years. It's not what I planned, but it pays the bills and I can take Penny to school." Catherine stood there in the institutional hallway with its fluorescent hum and its scuffed linoleum and its faint smell of cleaning solution, and she thought about the version of herself that had almost signed that document 40 minutes ago. The version of herself that had read page 9 4 times and chosen each time to believe the men in suits. "I have a position open," she said. Weston looked up. "Director of Financial Controls. I've been trying to fill it for 8 months. Everyone I've interviewed has the credentials and the polish, and I can tell within the first 10 minutes that they'll tell me what I want to hear." She met his eyes. "I don't want someone who'll tell me what I want to hear." He was quiet. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "Do you?" "You're thinking that you've been down this road before, that you did the right thing once, and it cost you everything, and there's no particular reason to believe this time would be different." He didn't confirm or deny it. He just looked at her with those steady, careful eyes. "I'm not offering you charity," she said. "I'm offering you a salary of $140,000, full benefits, and a title that reflects what you actually are, which is the most competent person who's been in any room I've sat in today." She paused. "What you do with that offer is entirely your business." The forensic accounting firm she retained worked for 11 days straight. What they found was not incompetence. Incompetence would have been almost forgivable, almost understandable, the kind of thing that happens when people move too fast and check too little. What they found was not incompetence. The depreciation error was one piece of it. There were others. A series of liability transfers that appeared in isolation to be standard intercompany accounting, but that, taken together, formed a pattern that an experienced eye would recognize immediately as deliberate obfuscation. Assets moved at undervalued prices. Loss figures inflated through the misapplication of accounting standards that, in each individual instance, could be explained away as a judgment call. Together, the picture was different. Douglas Payne, it turned out, had a relationship with Whitmore Capital that predated his engagement with Hartwell Meridian by 3 years. He had brought them 2 other acquisition targets. Both companies had signed. Both had been absorbed into Whitmore's portfolio at prices that subsequent market performance suggested were deeply improbably low. Catherine's attorney, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been practicing corporate law for 30 years and had seen most things, called her on a Tuesday evening and said, "Catherine, I want you to sit down before I tell you the rest of this." Catherine sat down. The rest of it was that Douglas had received from Whitmore Capital a payment of $450,000, transferred through 2 shell entities to an account in his wife's maiden name, scheduled for the week after Catherine's signature was supposed to have happened. She sat with the phone at her ear for a long time without saying anything. "Catherine," Sandra said. "I'm here," Catherine said. "This is actually good news. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but this is actually very good news." The legal proceedings took 18 months. Douglas Payne pled guilty to securities fraud. 3 executives at Whitmore Capital were charged. 2 of them eventually took deals. The 3rd went to trial, and Sandra Okafor was at the plaintiff's table the entire time, meticulous and relentless in the way that 30 years of practice makes you, if you're paying attention. Hartwell Meridian did not go bankrupt. The corrected financials, once the deliberate distortions were stripped away, showed a company that was stressed but fundamentally sound. Catherine renegotiated 2 of the most critical loan arrangements. She sold one property at a fair price rather than a distressed price, which made enough of a difference to cover the contractor liability that had started the whole cascade. By the end of it, she had 49 employees, 318 managed properties, and a reputation that had not only survived but had somehow emerged from the whole ordeal with a quality it had not possessed before, a kind of hardness that was not brittleness, the way certain metals get stronger under pressure rather than fracturing. Weston Carr's first week as Director of Financial Controls, he found a discrepancy in the payroll processing system that had been quietly overcharging employees for their health insurance premiums for 2 years. The total amount was slightly over $18,000. He flagged it, documented it, and presented Catherine with a remediation plan within 72 hours of finding it. She looked at the report and then she looked at him and she said, "How did you find that?" "I looked at the payroll reconciliation," he said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Douglas had a team of 4 people who were supposed to be doing that reconciliation every quarter. "I know." He paused. "I also found 3 others. Penny Carr turned 8 in October. Weston brought her in on a Saturday morning when the offices were empty and sunlight was coming through the windows at that particular angle that made the whole floor look warmer and more human than it did on a Monday in January. Penny was small for her age and extremely serious, with her father's careful eyes and an opinion about everything that she expressed with a directness that Catherine found immediately charming. She went around the office examining things with great deliberation. The scale model of a proposed development project, the framed architectural drawings, the whiteboard where someone had written a series of calculations and never erased them. She stood in front of the whiteboard for a long time. "What's this?" she said. "Projected returns on an investment," Catherine said. Penny studied it. "Are these the right numbers?" Catherine laughed. It came out surprised the way real laughter does. "Why do you ask that?" Penny turned around and looked at her with complete sincerity. "My dad says you always have to check the numbers." "Your dad is right," Catherine said. Penny seemed to weigh this. Then she nodded, the way very practical people do when a hypothesis has been confirmed by an independent source. "He usually is," she said. "He just doesn't always say so out loud." Weston, standing by the window with a cup of coffee, looked at his daughter with an expression Catherine had seen on very few faces in her professional life, a kind of unguarded, uncomplicated love that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the fact that this particular small person was the actual center of his actual world. She thought about the hallway, the cart, the electrical tape on the strap, the 4 years of early mornings and fluorescent lights and school drop-offs, carrying something that no resume had space to contain. She thought about the pen lying flat on the conference table. She thought about how close it had been. Catherine Hartwell gave the commencement address at Portland State's Business School 2 years after the Whitmore case closed. She had been asked 3 times before and had declined 3 times. Not from modesty, but because she had not been certain she had anything to say that was worth saying in a gymnasium full of people who were about to discover that the world did not work the way anyone had told them. She was certain now. She stood at the podium and she looked out at the rows of faces, young and alert and still carrying that particular combination of exhaustion and hope that belongs to people who have just finished something hard, and she said, "The most important financial insight of my career came from someone nobody in that room was supposed to listen to. It came from someone who was restocking a supply cart. It came from someone who had already paid an enormous price for knowing the right thing and doing it anyway, and who had decided, quietly, without fanfare, to simply keep doing it, even in a gray uniform, even in a hallway, even when there was no obvious reason to believe it would matter." She paused. Every system has people in it who know things, not because they were handed the information, because they were paying attention when no one thought it was worth watching. Those are the people who will save you if you let them, if you actually listen. She looked out at the crowd. The question is never whether someone like that is in the room. The question is whether you're paying enough attention to hear them. The gymnasium was quiet for a moment in the way that gymnasia rarely are. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone did, and Catherine stood at the podium and thought about a supply cart and a projected spreadsheet and $31 million sitting in plain sight on page 9, waiting for someone to look. Some things only become visible when you stop assuming you already know what you're looking at. I keep thinking about that pen, the way Catherine set it down flat on the table, not to the side, not carelessly, but parallel, deliberate, like she was marking the exact moment she chose to stop and listen. That one small gesture is the thing I come back to, because everything that followed came from it. There's a version of that story where she signs, where Douglas's voice and the auditors' voices and the men from Whitmore Capital with their matching suits and their sympathetic expressions, where all of that weight is just too much to push back against. And honestly, that version isn't hard to imagine. That version happens every day to people who are just as capable as Catherine Hartwell, who are just as smart and just as experienced, who simply ran out of time or energy or belief that one more question was worth asking. What I find myself sitting with is this: the information was always there. It was on page 9. It had been on page 9 through 4 separate reads, through 3 outside audits, through 2 weeks of Whitmore's own team walking the floors. The problem was never the numbers. The problem was who everyone in that room had already decided was worth listening to. Weston Card knew the answer. He'd known it the moment he glanced at that projected screen while restocking a supply cart. He knew it because he had spent years building the kind of mind that notices things. Not because anyone was watching, not because there was any reward for it, but because that's just who he was. That's integrity working quietly in a gray uniform at 11 o'clock at night. You can't fake that. You can't manufacture it when the moment arrives. It either lives in you all the time or it doesn't live in you at all. And then there's the part that I think matters most. The part that doesn't get talked about enough. Weston had already paid the price for speaking up once. He had done the right thing at Rowan & Associates, and it had cost him his career and 4 years of his life and the kind of professional standing that took decades to rebuild. He had every rational reason to look at that spreadsheet on the wall and keep pushing his cart. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have blamed him. He spoke up anyway. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, actually. That's what resilience actually looks like when you strip away all the inspirational language around it. It's not the absence of being beaten down. It's the decision to keep showing up honestly after you have been. It's Weston taking Penny to school in the morning and doing his job with the same care he brought to a much bigger job. Because the size of the audience doesn't change what the work deserves. I think about the people in my own life who have held that kind of knowledge quietly. The ones I walked past without really seeing. The question Catherine asked from the podium at the end of her story, whether you're paying enough attention to hear them, that question doesn't just apply to boardrooms. It applies to every room, every conversation, every moment when someone who doesn't look like the expected answer is trying to tell you something true. The cause is always there before the effect. Douglas's choices built toward a consequence that was always going to arrive eventually. Catherine's willingness to stop, just for one moment, to let an unexpected voice finish its sentence, that built toward something too. So did 4 years of Weston Carr doing honest work in a building full of people who didn't know his name. What you practice in the small moments is what you become in the large one. That's not a lesson anyone handed me. It's just what I see when I look at this story clearly.